Miami's weaknesses, the same ones we've seen all season, were at their worst on Tuesday night. They got out-rebounded, out-muscled, and outplayed, and now face elimination from the postseason. What went wrong and who's to blame? We'll tell you on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat. I'm Wes Goldberg here with David Ramil. However you might be tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app, thanks so much for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Go to HelloFresh.com/NBA60. Use the code NBA60 for 60% off and free shipping. Recording this after the Heat lose to the Hawks 116-105 in the play-in game. Just a really weird, disappointing game, and not at all what I thought most people were expecting going into this one. The Heat came out, fell behind by 24 points early on. They tried to come back, but every time they cut it to 5, 6, 7. It just felt like Trae Young would make a big play, or the Hawks would just grab a key offensive rebound, get a putback, and sort of end that run. The Hawks out-rebounded the Heat 63-39 in this one. They scored 26 second-chance points off of 27 offensive rebounds. They outscored the Heat 64-46 in the paint. The Hawks were the bigger, more physical team, and to quote Tyler Herro after the game, they beat the hell out of us. David, what did you see in this one?
Well, I wasn't as surprised by Trae's big night. A lot of people had been making a big deal about, Miami has Trae's number and things of that sort. And yes, they certainly did a pretty good job defensively on him in the playoffs. But I think a lot of that had been overstated to a certain degree. But what I really was most surprised about is how badly Jimmy Butler led Miami. He was atrocious. And I don't think there's any other way of saying it. I think Miami was playing a style that seemed like it was, something similar to what they've done all season. But in terms of Jimmy Butler, he's been so consistent, such a great player and able to carry Miami even through these weak spots. And tonight, he just didn't have it at all. He was missing shots at the rim, not making plays defensively, missing shots at the free throw line. His 21 points really looks like, it's a pretty good outing for him. A lot of that were very gifted trips to the free throw line. The same kind of trips to the free throw line that I would complain if James Harden or Joel Embiid or anybody else that seems like a foul merchant would have been getting. So I don't know that we could really look at Jimmy's stat line and say anything other than what a really bad night he had. So that was what really stood out to me, was how badly Jimmy Butler played. Aside from that,
let's stay up. Let's stick to Jimmy Butler because it's a good point. 36 seconds into this game, he walks into a layup, absolutely no interference whatsoever by Atlanta. And I'm like, Is this what the Hawks are going to do tonight?
Right.
And the answer turned out to be no. And it kind of felt like more like the Heat were the team kind of doing the letting of the waltzing more so than the Atlanta Hawks. And that was the easiest bucket Jimmy Butler had the entire game. After that, the Hawks made it physical on him. They put John Collins on him quite a bit. They put DeAndre Hunter on him quite a bit. You could tell he was a little uncomfortable with that matchup because he kept trying to get those guys switched off of him, which I was a little surprised by, to be honest. And even then, even when he kind of got free and shook loose of those defenders, those bigger guys that the Hawks have, those longer guys that they have, he missed 4 point-blank shots at the rim in the first half. It was so uncharacteristic of Jimmy Butler, and I couldn't help it. When I was sitting here on Media Row and kind of watching the game and watching Jimmy, I couldn't help but feel like maybe I've sort of taken for granted how sort of automatic Jimmy Butler was in terms of always rising to the occasion. It's not to say that he doesn't have bad games, but it always felt like when it really mattered, when it mattered the most, he would just come out and have an efficient game and shoot 60% and get to the line 18 times. And he could just do it. He could just sort of dial it up. And we always kind of joke, playoff Jimmy, playoff, when is he going to flip the kind of switch on that? Right. And maybe it's not that simple. Maybe this year has taken such a toll on everybody, and that includes Jimmy Butler, who I think previously we just sort of thought of as sort of invincible, as Bam could get tired, Caleb can get tired, Kyle Lowry could get banged up and all these things, but Jimmy Butler always he felt like that stuff just didn't stick to him. Everything just sort of bounced off of him, literally and figuratively. And I don't know. Like tonight, it just felt like he was tired, and that was just strange to me. Like it was. I just didn't expect to see that.
That's fine. I don't think that's the case. I'll be 100% honest with you. I don't think he was tired because he had plenty of rest. He had, the last game.
You think he just didn't step up, which is even more weird then. If he just didn't rise to the occasion.
Right, because he earlier in practice he said, he doesn't care who he's facing, whatever. Like we've heard from this pretty consistently over Jimmy's tenure here, that it doesn't matter who he's facing. This reminds me so much of being stupidly locked in before going into the Bucks series back in 2021, and it was rather unfortunate because it's just Jimmy got outplayed. And I don't know. I know that you pointed out to some of the defensive issues there in terms of Atlanta really sending a bigger, more athletic body, or at least somebody to challenge Jimmy. But that doesn't excuse the shots at the rim. And I don't think that was just exhaustion or anything like that. Some of those shots just didn't fall. And I don't understand. Like and then he usually ramps it up in another way, either by forcing a turnover or getting there. But even then, there were just moments where he seemed indecisive, or worse yet, there were moments. I think there was after Tyler scored 6 points to kick off the second half, where again he closed the lead because Tyler did have a good offensive game for the most part, and then Jimmy had a fast break situation there, and rather than dishing it off to the wide open Tyler Herro on the wing, he chooses to engage, I think it was Hunter, and what had been a mismatch all game, and that's looking to get himself going rather than looking to get your teammate who clearly has the hot hand. And I don't think it necessarily has to be my shot versus your shot, but that's kind of how it felt like for Jimmy tonight. And it sucks to blame Jimmy considering how great he's been all season long. But
yeah, I thought
where else to go but to blame Jimmy tonight.
It starts with Jimmy Butler, no doubt about it. Look, in terms of whether or not he was trying to get other guys involved, like that third quarter when the Heat had that big run to open up the third quarter. So Kyle Lowry scores 10 straight points in the final 2.5 minutes right before halftime to bring the Heat back within 10 points or 15 points, going into that break. And then they come out with like a 13-2 run, I think it was. And Jimmy Butler, Tyler Herro is doing all the scoring. Like he scored like 8 points in 90 seconds. But Jimmy Butler assisted on like 4 of Tyler's like 5 shots in the third quarter. He had 6 assists overall. Jimmy Butler did in that third quarter where they cut the deficit to 5. So I thought his playmaking was actually pretty good. But to your point, it did sort of feel like it was like this big spurt of 6 straight assists. And for the rest of the game, it wasn't really there. And he felt like out of rhythm. Look, I don't know, is choke too strong of a word to use with Jimmy Butler? Because if it's not exhaustion, if there's no excuse for missing those point-blank shots at the rim, I mean, him and Bam were both really bad at the basket. Yes. The two of them combined to go 9 of 27 in the paint. So they missed 18 of their 27 paint shots. Again, counting just the Jimmy Butler ones, it was like 4 or 5 of them just right at the basket. Just you just don't see him miss those, like basically ever. And he missed so many of them tonight. Is choke too strong of a word?
I think it is. Choking, it has to be over a more consistent amount of time for it to just be choking in a one-off situation, because any player can have a bad game. And we've seen Bam have bad games. We've seen Jimmy have bad games, or at least subpar performances over the course of the postseason. So I'm not going to go so far as to say tonight was a choke job on his part. I think that gets tossed around a little too easily. They both sucked. And that's fine. That's bad enough. That's just for them to be as bad as they were. I think that's the ultimate bottom line of it. And it's fair to say so. They both played terribly. They both underperformed. I think they'll both admit that they underperformed. To your point, though, I wonder if, maybe they felt like they were carrying the team to a certain degree earlier in the game before Kyle stepped up, because Kyle really was phenomenal. Tyler was getting his points, but Max Strus was really bad as a starter yet again. Gabe Vincent was pretty poor as a starter. He looked like he was missing a lot of shots early on. So I don't know if he just felt like maybe there's only so much that we could do as the two best players of the team. But you've made this point before, and it's a good one. You're the two best players of the team for a reason. You've got to step up when it's supposed to be, and when the game's, the season is on the line practically. You've got to do what you can to be able to face a better opponent in Boston. Now you go up, and if you're able to eliminate either the Chicago Bulls or Toronto on Friday night, then you face a much tougher opponent in the Milwaukee Bucks. Terrible place for Miami to be in.
The rebounding issue is another big issue. There's plenty of blame to go around. We are going to talk about which team the Heat would rather play Friday night between the Raptors and the Bulls. All of that is coming up later on. But first, today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Pro Basketball GM. Look, it's the coolest game that I've played in a really long time. I've always thought that I could be a great NBA general manager, and it turns out it's not all that easy. If you've had the same thought as I have and fantasized about managing your own basketball franchise, go and download Ultimate Pro Basketball GM right now. The game allows you to manage every strategic aspect of a franchise, playing through seasons and leading your franchise and fans to glory as you build a historic dynasty. In the simulation, you'll be responsible for dealing with challenging personalities, hiring the right coaches, the right assistants, trading and training players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all of the ups and downs of multiple seasons. All of this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Pro Basketball GM is completely free. It's playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. David, you know that I had past tense, I had a dynasty going on. I have an update on my Pro Basketball GM dynasty. After 2 straight trips to the finals, 2 straight championships, we were going for a third, which I think would have been a legitimate dynasty. And my power forward got injured. My star power forward got injured in the first round. We end up making out of the first round, but it's not enough. He was out for the entire postseason. We lost to a much better, more healthy team in the second round. Ended that one. And then my players were starting to get older. It kind of felt like 2015, 2016, San Antonio Spurs, like Tim Duncan, Tony Parker. They were getting up there in age. We went one last run, and then my star point guard, future Hall of Famer, he retired. My power forward retired. And then I just traded everybody. I went full end of that Celtics Big Three era, trading all my players to the Nets, and I got a bunch of draft picks. So I'm rebuilding. I'm retooling, I should say. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, Locked On Heat listeners can get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in the game store. So make sure to check it out. To download the game, just visit probasketballgm.com, scan the code, or look it up on the App Store. That's probasketballgm.com. Ultimate Pro Basketball GM. Start your dynasty today. Locked On Heat is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please do subscribe. Well, that smell you smell is the smell of another smelly loss. It's time to hand out some blame pie. We talked a lot about Jimmy Butler and to a certain degree also Bam Adebayo. We got to start with Jimmy. We've got 10 slices of blame pie to hand out. If you and I are on the same page here, I think 5 is the starting point.
I'd say 5, but I think Bam gets his fair share as well, and then you've got to dole some out to almost everybody else. I guess 5. If you're giving Jimmy a little bit more than we're giving Bam, which it seems like that's how you're trending, 5 sounds about right.
I'll give 3 to Bam. I thought his defense tonight was basically the only good part of Miami's defense. I actually thought Bam was quite good. Yeah. I mean, he was able to switch on to Trae Young several times and stop him. Like, the best moments defensively in this game came from Bam Adebayo and not much else. But let's talk.
Getting his hands up there. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But let's talk about the rebounding discrepancy, because that was sort of the big outlier in this game. The Heat got out-rebounded 63-39. The Hawks had 22 offensive rebounds in this game. They had 26 second-chance points. The biggest offensive rebound for the Hawks in this one came right after Tyler Herro made a floater to cut the lead to, I think, 9 at that point. It was a 9-point deficit there. And the Hawks come down the other end. Caleb Martin, he was guarding Trae Young in those closing minutes. He forces a tough Trae Young three-pointer. It bounces off the front of the rim. The Heat, again, fail to box out. The ball sort of bounces into Clint Capella's pocket. Capella comes away with it. The Heat foul. They run a sideline out of bounds play. DeJounte Murray gets it and makes a 2-pointer to turn that 9-point deficit into an 11-point deficit with a couple minutes left to go in the game. And that was basically the dagger, right? Even up until then, it was out. It did not seem realistic that the Heat could come back in that one, but that was sort of like the last gasp, the last chance. They kept getting back 5 points, 6 points, 7 points, 9 points here and there, where it was a 24-point deficit early in the game. And just every time they would get it close, it just felt like the Hawks came up with a big offensive rebound. I don't know. Was it effort tonight? Was it?
No, it's schematic and
schematic.
Yeah, I think so. It was. You're switching Bam Adebayo as your only big, And let's face it, with this smaller lineup, I mean, there's only so many different options you could go to. Basically, you have Clint Capella, who's not a bad player. He's just limited in his role and always has been, but he was, pretty damn good in that role when he was playing pick and roll with James Harden back in the Houston days.
He's always been a good rebounder.
He's always been a good rebounder, and that was evident when he's getting boxed out by 6'0" Gabe Vincent and 6'5" Max Strus. Like, there's a wealth of possibilities there, and that's basically what it was. He was just getting easy boards. And if it's not Capella, then it's John Collins at 6'11" or DeAndre Hunter at 6'7", 6'8". All these bigs out there, and you're going up against a much smaller lineup. And you basically look. Trae Young had 8 rebounds in the night, so it's just unbelievable to think how active Atlanta was. But I think a lot of that was just your one big. Being out of the box, out of the painted area because he's guarding somebody out on the perimeter, and that leads to either a pull-down rebound for Capella or somebody else or a tip. So many of the tips just going in Atlanta's favor, so you've got to give their bigs, Capella, Okongwu, whoever it was out there, just got to give them some credit because they were really just keeping the ball alive. Every 50-50 play seemed like it was going in Atlanta's favor.
Yeah.
I think a big part of it was that switching defense.
So you might want to actually give some blame pie to Spoelstra, it sounds like.
I don't because
okay.
What are you going to do? I mean, we're not going to go now and just say blame Pat Riley or anything like that. But you went in there with a roster that was deficient, and like the idea that, and maybe we should say this again, but the idea was that you're facing an Atlanta team that you've kind of had their number in the past. But I remember for the last couple of seasons, Atlanta was always a dangerous team in the sense that they're faster, quicker, more athletic, more mobile against a team like Miami, especially even last year with PJ Tucker. They were older. You didn't know what we were going to be facing in that sense. And they showed why they could have been a stronger team. Like, I know they're also more likely to implode because of that youth and everything else. But tonight, it was certainly a big positive in their favor.
That's what stood out to me was just how much bigger and stronger they are. So schematic, roster building, whatever, like they are bigger, faster, stronger. And I couldn't help but watch this game and just be like, I've said this before. I can't remember what game it was, but it was in another loss. And I was like, it felt like the Heat were a Conference USA team going up against an SEC athletes. And that's what it felt like again tonight in this one. Like they were just huge and there was nothing that the Heat could do. And you could blame the 50-50 balls. I think at one point, like a 50-50 ball bounced right back to an Atlanta Hawk, and I think it was Kyle Lowry. He kind of just like laughed on the court in the middle of the second half because he was like, he's like, again, another one. Yeah. And look, it did appear that a lot of those balls were bouncing their way, but that does not describe the discrepancy, 63-39. Maybe if there's like 5 or 6 loose balls, that's still a huge discrepancy, right? Like, and I don't even blame the effort. I don't even blame the effort. It's not an effort thing for me necessarily. They did miss some box outs late in the game, but like, no team ever worked hard to a championship. Like at some point, you just need to have size, strength, speed, athleticism, talent. Like it's like no team ever just tried hard to a championship. You need a base level of that talent, that size, all of that stuff. And the Heat clearly don't have it. It's been the case all season long. It kind of came to a crescendo in tonight's game where they couldn't make shots. Jimmy Butler looked tired. Bam Adebayo looked tired. Caleb Martin looks exhausted and has since the All-Star break and even a little bit before then. Like this team just doesn't have it. They're running on fumes right now, and you could feel it looking at them, watching them, talking to them, listening to how they're talking about these games and the game on Friday night even after this one in the post-game press conference. Like, this team just doesn't have it, and I know everybody said, they got the Hawks number. They're this record against Trae Young. They did this to Trae Young in the past. This team is not last year's team. And in case anybody needed further reminding of that, because if it wasn't evident enough, this game underscored that in a big way. This team has nothing to do with last year's team. Last year's team was a shot away from the finals. Good for them. That is not this year's team. Not even close. And we could discuss, and we've tried to figure out why that is. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, but that's the bottom line. This is just not the same team. It's not close to being the same team. They're not very good. They're exactly where they should be, in my opinion, is fighting for their playoff life on Friday night. So in terms of blame pie, if we really want to do it, 5 to Jimmy. I'm going to do 3 to Bam. I do think probably, I don't know. I really don't know where else to go with
it. 1 to Vincent.
Fine.
And
that's it.
That's it. All right. Yeah.
All right. Very good.
Everybody else gets to be there in the waft of that stench, though, so they all get to suffer as a result.
I was almost at the point where I was like, just put Yurtseven in. Just play a front line of Yurt and Bam. I was like, let's just first time all season, just try it
Brandon
now.
Robinson, yeah, I mean something.
I was seriously considering there's a reason why Cody Zeller had to play so many minutes off the bench. He played or not so many minutes. He had 3.5 minutes off the bench. Kevin Love played 3.5 minutes off the bench. Bam Adebayo had to play 41 minutes. Like he had to play basically the entire second half. Jimmy Butler had to play 38 minutes. Kyle Lowry had to play almost 33. Just some quick rebounding numbers before we move on here. John Collins, 3 offensive rebounds. Clint Capella, 8 offensive rebounds. Sadiq Bey, 4 offensive rebounds. Jalen Johnson, 3 offensive rebounds. And it felt like every Jalen Johnson offensive rebound was followed quickly by a dunk. Like he scored off all 3 of those offensive rebounds, it felt like. Certainly 2 of them in the second half. Like, that's crazy. That is crazy. But you can't just blame the 50-50 balls. Like Tyler Herro said, it was the quote I read before. They beat the hell out of us. They did. Kyle Lowry, after the game, was like, it was tough not being 6'9" out there. You know, like that's everything you need to know. That's everything.
I know nobody wants to hear anything positive right now, but can we give him his just desserts? Because
Kyle Lowry, let's do that on the other side. Yeah, let's do that on the other side.
All right, we'll save that for the next segment when we talk about Friday's upcoming game, because Miami has to face somebody, and who knows whether or not they'll be able to advance to face the Milwaukee Bucks in the playoffs. But we'll determine which team might be better for a Miami matchup on Friday. But before we do that, just a reminder that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Grand slams, no hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. You place your first bet, and you get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. There's so many different options to choose from, whether it's baseball, the NBA playoffs, college football, basketball, whatever you like, any sport you can imagine, you go to FanDuel, you'll be able to find something there. Don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you go to FanDuel. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball.
Marlins beat the Phillies tonight, so we got that going for us.
Hey, FanDuel.
Reach Locked On Heat, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us, lockedonheat@gmail.com. We're going to talk about which team the Heat would prefer to play between the Bulls and the Raptors in a minute. But first, you wanted to hand Kyle Lowry his flowers. 33 points, a Miami Heat career high. If it counts, these play-in stats just sort of go into nothingness. They just sort of evaporate as soon as the final buzzer sounds. So I don't know if it's going to count, but it's more points than he's ever scored in a Miami Heat uniform. He was awesome tonight, David.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. He was confident, taking his shots, driving to the rim, explosive, just looking. It didn't matter who was in front of him. Like there was one player who wasn't afraid of the moment, and you would have thought that would have been Jimmy Butler beforehand. It was actually 36-year-old Kyle Lowry taking shots from long range, looking healthy, looking engaged, looking quite honestly like the only Heat player who actually cared about the outcome of the game. Maybe you could say that about Tyler Herro. And you know that Jimmy and Bam are invested in the season to a certain degree. But as far as the actual outcome of tonight was concerned, I don't think any player was as invested or cared as much as Kyle Lowry. He looked like he just wanted to win. He was almost single-handedly trying to will his team back into contention, leading multiple comebacks throughout the night single-handedly. You talked about his points before the end of the half. Then he did it again in the third and fourth quarter, cutting an 11-point lead down to 6 midway through, just to watch it all fall apart again. He was fantastic. Unfortunately,
14 points in the fourth quarter for Kyle Lowry. He opens it up with a huge three-pointer, cut the lead to 10. He then, on the next possession, finds Gabe Vincent for a three-pointer, makes a tough layup to cut the deficit to 8. Another three-pointer after that to cut it to 6. He then had back-to-back three-pointers off of dribble handoffs with Bam Adebayo, which I tweeted this. I was like, where has this been the entire season? Kyle Lowry coming off of dribble handoffs from Bam Adebayo. He makes back-to-back ones to make it a 7-point game with 5 minutes left. Like to your point, every time the Heat had a comeback, it was sort of Kyle Lowry in the middle of it, right? And so he was fantastic. And I do think it's worth also mentioning that he played almost 33 minutes tonight. When talking with Kyle after practice the other day, he was talking to the media and he said, yeah, I'm ready to sort of ramp up my minutes. We know that he's been on sort of a 25-ish minutes restriction over the last several weeks of the regular season. That was all geared towards him ramping up those minutes in the playoffs when they really, really count. And you and I have bounced this idea, like, are they going to do the Goran Dragic thing and just insert him into the starting lineup? I don't know that they're going to do that, but it does look like no matter at bare minimum, he's going to be playing starters minutes at 32, 33 minutes tonight. I think that's what we're going to see going forward if he's looking this fresh. However forward that is, I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. Was there an update on Gabe Vincent after the game? Because it seemed like he rolled his ankle or might have hurt something in his lower leg.
We didn't get anything, but we didn't hear anything. So yeah,
I imagine he'll be available. I imagine he'll start also. I mean, at this point, though, I mean, maybe it's worth asking: would you start Kyle Lowry, or do you like his energy coming off the bench? I think I'd keep him off the bench moving forward.
I'll keep him off the bench because it's just easier to monitor it. Like, he looked fresh tonight. Is he going to look fresh Friday? I don't know. It's hard to know with a 36-year-old point guard, right? And so it's easier to just sort of to manage his minutes when he's coming off the bench. So I think they'll keep doing that, but we'll see. All right, so Wednesday night, the Toronto Raptors are going to host the Chicago Bulls in the 9-10 game. So the way that the play-in works, the loser of the 7-8 game, in this case the Miami Heat, will play the winner of the 9-10 game. So, and the Heat will play that game at Kaseya Center here at home. So, between the Raptors and the Bulls, who do you think the Heat would prefer to play Friday night?
Well, I just think the springy nature of the Toronto Raptors makes them a little bit more dangerous. We just saw what happened to Miami when you get out-rebounded, outsized in general, and that's basically the Toronto Raptors roster in a nutshell. So, they might not have the same kind of three-point variance as the Atlanta Hawks do. They don't have the same playmaking ability, but I don't know that I necessarily want to test Fred VanVleet or anything like that. So if I'm hoping that Chicago advances because I think they're probably the better matchup for Miami. But both those teams have a combined 1-6 record against Miami in the regular season. I know the regular season doesn't really matter all that much, but as we're finding out with this Heat team, maybe it matters a lot more than you might think. So both those teams seem to have something that could make them dangerous against the Heat. You're basically weighing the overall strength of the Toronto Raptors versus the single quarter dominance of DeMar DeRozan, who we've seen have incredible moments against this Miami Heat team. He could go for 35, 40 points very easily because he's going to get his trips to the line. He's got that mid-range accuracy, and if that's the case, that makes him pretty dangerous. Of the two, however, I guess I'd rather take my chances on DeMar. And neither of them seem palatable. I think I'd rather take option C at this point, which is to lose against either. It's just for the chance for Miami to enter into this offseason already. Because if they're not going to put out any effort the way they did tonight, it's clear that they're ready for their vacation to start immediately.
No doubt about it. I'd rather play the Chicago Bulls. The Raptors, I said the same thing. What the Hawks were able to do with their size, with their strength, with their athleticism, that's what the Raptors do, and that's what they did to the Heat. The last time these teams played at the end of March, the Raptors handedly beat the Miami Heat in that game in Toronto. They had 15 offensive rebounds in that game. They outscored the Heat 62-36 in points in the paint in that game. So exactly what the Hawks did tonight against the Heat, the Raptors did this late last month against the Miami Heat, and they could do it again because that's their whole strategy. Pascal Siakam, Jakob Poeltl, that is a big front line. They've got Scotty Barnes, they've got OG Anunoby, they've got a lot of size in that on that roster up and down, and so it would be the same thing, I think, as what we saw, or could potentially be, I should say. It could potentially be the same thing. In terms of the Chicago Bulls, they're somehow pretty good defensively and very bad offensively, which is not what you would expect looking at that roster on paper.
Right.
I don't trust the Chicago Bulls. I think I think they were lucky to be I think they're the number 10 seed by default. It's just that every other team in the East stinks. And so the Bulls just sort of back their way into the playoffs. I'm not impressed with them. DeMar DeRozan is scary, but not so scary that I would rather play him than I'm not scared of Zach LaVine. He could be beaten on defense. Jimmy Butler could pick on him. Nikola Vucevic is a good rebounder, but he's kind of the only one on the Bulls where I'm more scared of like the multiple rebounding bodies that the Toronto Raptors can throw at the glass. So we'll see what happens Wednesday night. Toronto, that game versus Chicago. That game will be played in Toronto. I kind of feel like the Raptors win that game, but also with all this Nick Nurse stuff and all that kind of stuff in the air, I don't know. Maybe they're also kind of out of whack, and maybe the Bulls come away with it. Like we just saw, man. Like these games are much closer to 50-50 than I think most people realize. It's one game. It's high stakes, high variance, and one big rebounding game, one great shooting game from somebody, one big game from off the bench, off of from guys like Sadiq Bey and Jalen Johnson. I mean, something like that can swing a game. So we'll see what happens, and we'll see who the Heat play on Friday. Until then, we will have more. We will, as soon as we find out, have a preview of who they are going to play and what that game could look like. We got a lot more stuff coming this week, but for now, that'll do it. Thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Remember to subscribe to new episodes of Locked On Heat on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Now make your second listen Game to Game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result, Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA and during the playoffs with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. It's available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. David, thanks for joining me.
You got it, Wes.